Please give a warm Georgia Tech welcome to Mr. Tom Tierney.
A+. So hi everybody, my name's Tom, and I want to be useful to you. The title of my talk is pretty ambitious. I want to talk to you a little about the social sector. Some of you may be interested in that. And step back about what's really happening in a way that might be useful to you folks someday. Philanthropy, and I say, what about philanthropy? I don't have any money. I have debts. I want to talk about philanthropy in the context of giving, because it turns out giving time is just as important as giving money, and some of the ideas around philanthropy may apply to volunteering and how you spend your time. And then I want to talk throughout this, and especially at the end, about a topic that's near and dear to each of us, which is yourselves. I don't have answers, but I might provoke a couple of questions. Today, if you were to step back and take a photograph of the social sector in America, make that a moving picture. And let's say that moving picture extended back 10 or 15 years. So you could see dynamically what was going on with nonprofit organizations, businesses, and places that somehow tried to serve society. You would see an amazing amount of change. In fact, you'd see two great themes colliding and tumbling around, driving that change. One theme relates to money, the other theme relates to talent. Let me talk about money first. Recently, Warren Buffett, Bill and Melinda Gates announced the Giving Pledge. 69 billionaires, that's the number that have been publicly listed, have agreed to give at least half their wealth to society. They might say, gosh, why don't they give all of it? Many of them are giving all of it. But the notion that 69 billionaires in this country would step forward and say, all right, I'll sign the Giving Pledge. You go to givingpledge.org, you can see who signed up. You can see what the essays they've written about what they're trying to do. Historically unprecedented. But it's not just about billionaires. Check out Network for Good. Network for Good is an online giving organization that started years ago as a consortium. It was AOL, Cisco, and Yahoo. Before Yahoo was what it is in the AOL. It was a different era, but nevertheless, great companies. And they came together and said, how can we help people find nonprofit organizations to give small amounts of money to? They've now helped enable hundreds of millions of dollars to go into many, many, many nonprofit organizations that would not have had it otherwise. So you've got big money, not such big money, maybe more traditional giving, highly innovative, technology-driven giving. But what about this talent flow stuff? Most business people, most folks that lead organizations and have thought about such things, and certainly all the great writers in business and leadership will say people matter more than money. Hands down. Hands down. If you're betting on an organization, you're first and foremost betting on the organization. You're not betting on the organization's balance sheet. So money is necessary but not sufficient. Talent is what drives results every time. So what's going on with talent? Teach for America. You all know Teach for America. 50,000 applications for 5,000 jobs. I knew Wendy Kopp before she was Wendy Kopp. And this concept, why would people choose to work for very little money in an inner city school, really tough conditions? Huge numbers of people apply. What's going on there? What's going on with this notion of encore careers? If you Google encore careers, you will learn about people in their 50s and 60s, sort of in the next phase, back phase of their life, who want to move from what someone's called success to significance. They want to work on serving society. They don't want to play golf. They want to, quote, retire. Then you see people mid-careers who are trying to shift. You see volunteerism at an all-time high. You see participation in communities. Students on up, all-time high. It's this talent flow that's augmented and tumbled around with the money flow that's helping drive this historic era in the social sector of America. You say, gosh, what do you mean this historic era? So I'll get to this in a minute, but we wrote the Bridgespan business plan when I was running a company in about 1995, 1996. And so if you think about what's happened in the last 15 years, it's extraordinary. It's not a tipping point, as is discussed. It's actually a tipping phase. And I'll just run down a list of the kinds of things that have occurred in the last 15 years. All of this is new. And it's new organizations, it's new technologies, it's just massive numbers of new stuff. To start with, new global activities. Clinton Global Initiative didn't exist 15 years ago. Endeavor Global, which develops kind of high-impact entrepreneurs in various countries, didn't exist. It didn't exist 10 years, 15 years ago. Microfinance field basically didn't exist 10 to 15 years ago. New approaches to philanthropy. We've talked about donor choose, but donor advised funds where people give money, appreciated stock or something to Fidelity or Schwab or other, and then they can subsequently give that money to charity. Tens of billions of dollars of assets now didn't exist 15 years ago. Capital aggregators, ClimateWorks, 5 foundations get together, commit $1 billion. $1 billion to work together to solve climate change didn't exist. The Tiger Foundation, which is this foundation in New York, or Robert Hunt Foundation, where they aggregate funding from wealthy people around charitable events and other things, in those cases, both those cases, to help reduce poverty in New York City. So you've got venture philanthropy partners, social venture partners, giving circles. There's a circle in LA with it's all women. It's what is it? 200 women give $5,000 a year, a $1 million a year grant to a deserving nonprofit. They've been at it 10 years. These kinds of things did not exist 15 years ago. New financial models. You might read about impact investing or social investment bonds, where you've got other kinds of financial tools that have a for-profit or cash flow element to them, but where social change is the objective. New education vehicles. 15 years ago, Harvard Business School launched something called the Social Enterprise Initiative. It was the first business school in America to begin to incorporate social enterprise, the nonprofit sector, into its business curriculum. Now, and I know it's true here, it's true throughout American higher education and now more and more undergraduate education, where the nonprofit sector, serving society, volunteering, the social sector is embedded into the curriculum. That's relatively new. You also have new mechanisms for enhancing talent flow. We launched a job board to help nonprofit organizations find executive talent. Last year it was rated number 2 by 2 different organizations. 2 of 97. Who knew? 97 job boards for the nonprofit sector? How many were there 10 years ago? 0. There are all these other mechanisms for developing talent, for finding talent that literally didn't exist. Idealist.org would be another example. There are intermediaries. If you took a snapshot 10 years ago of our moving picture and a snapshot today, 10 years ago, you'd see, there weren't consulting firms, executive search firms. There weren't executive education organizations serving the nonprofit sector. Now there are dozens. GuideStar, Idealist.org, Bridgespan, of course, Bridgestar, we mentioned, a number of them. Dozens did not exist 15 years ago. There's language that didn't exist. The phrase social entrepreneur, which was mentioned earlier, that didn't exist 15 years ago. Social return on investment, that didn't exist 15 years ago. Venture philanthropy, that didn't exist 15 years ago. So I could go on and on and on, and I won't. But you get the idea. We're looking at our movie 15 years ago. We're looking at our movie today. Important to think dynamically. Footnote, most people can't think dynamically. Most people aren't thinking about their life. They're not thinking about where they were, where they are, where they're going in a truly dynamic, where we tend to focus on the here and now. It's how we are. We might look out a year. It's very hard to look out 5 years. It's very hard to remember what we didn't used to know. And what we didn't used to know was the size and growth and expansion of the social sector and how that's beginning to change America. And by the way, I don't have to say this to this group. The lines are blurring also. We try to find a corporation now that doesn't think about its environmental strategy, its sustainability, or at least isn't talking about it. 15 years ago, was that the case? Was Walmart worrying about purchasing in a more environmentally friendly way 15 years ago? Not really. You had body shops and others. So the boundaries between business and social sector are evolving. The boundaries between government and social sector are evolving. It's just extraordinary. Now, I'm kind of aware of this because I've been in the middle of it. And I'm only aware in kind of what I know, so we're all hampered by what we don't know. So I can only describe my bit of it. But in the 1990s, I was running a pretty successful private multinational company. I'd grown up in California. I went to a university called UC Davis, which I was really proud to go to. When I graduated, I was a bus driver. And there's nothing wrong, by the way, with being a bus driver. It's a really good job. You know where you're going. You know where you've been. It's kind of, for folks that like kind of predictability, it's perfect. But it didn't have a lot of upside. And ended up meeting someone whose dad I worked at an engineering construction company, and I'd studied some engineering and economics. His name was Bill, and Bill's dad worked at a company called Bechtel. And through a bunch of serendipitous stuff, any of you, a few engineers around here, I ended up as a field engineer in Africa. And so there I am in Africa, and I don't need to tell the whole life story, but I want there's a footnote on this one, which is, you can't always predict your future, and keep your eyes open for things that matter. Decide to apply to business school. I'd only been on a plane once in my life prior to going to Africa, and that was to fly from San Francisco to LA. I'd been out of the country once before that to Tijuana. My dad worked in a factory. So here I am in Africa. I apply to business school. I get accepted, lo and behold, at Harvard Business School. Unbelievable. I wasn't sure where Harvard was. I was sure it wasn't in California. That was all I was sure about. And I learned later why I got accepted. I was the only application that year from Algeria. And they sent me there's this test, I don't know if foreign students, there's this test, this TOEFL test for non-English speaking students, so it's English. I aced it. I aced the puppy. And so there I am. I'm going from Oran, Algeria to Cambridge. And Oran, I understood construction, I understood blue collar stuff. I was very, very comfortable swearing. And end up in Cambridge, which was different, quite a bit different. And I had to wear a coat, and people called me Mr. Tierney, at least at that time at Harvard Business School. It was bizarre. But nevertheless, accommodated that. And there are some messages there because I remembered my roots. I remembered my roots. My dad was a working class man, and he had an ideal of how to live a life. And I don't think he ever would have quoted these words, but this was a theme. And the theme was, it's not what you have that matters, it's who you are. And who you are is a function of what you do, not what you say. Your life is a life of action. Your life will be defined by what you do at the end of your days. It won't be defined by, gosh, I wish I woulda, shoulda, coulda. And it certainly won't be defined by what's in your bank account or by what kind of house you have or what kind of car you drive. And that's a value that I had when I was at Davis. It's a value that I had as a bus driver. It's a value that I had in Algeria. I'm not saying it's everybody's value, but it was my value. So in the mid-90s, here I am running this company. The company, by the way, is in the news a lot lately. It's a private company, but it's one of those funny things that life you can't predict. It was Bain & Company. So Bain's in the news a lot because in 1984, we spun off a company called Bain Capital, which was an investment company. So this consulting company, Bain & Co. Inc., it spins off Bain Capital. The idea that, gosh, we're really helping our clients, consulting clients succeed. Let's invest. Raised outside money and started investing. Bain Capital grew and grew and grew and grew, run by a guy named Mitt Romney, who is in the news a lot lately. And then in I joined Bain and out of business school. It was my finishing. I thought I'd stay 2 years. I stayed 20. Those things happened too. But I kept learning. I wanted to stay. It wasn't winning by default. But in 1990-ish or so, Bain got in trouble. It's all public. There was too much debt on the firm. The founders really hadn't transitioned to the next generation effectively. The fine people, they built the thing. But we hit a giant speed bump. We invited Mitt into, more than invited, we asked, we requested, we semi-begged Mitt to leave Bain Capital and come into Bain & Co. Inc. and help us restructure. With the blessing of Bill Bain and the founders, he did that. Spent a year and a half. Then went back to Bain Capital. During that year and a half, I worked with him, ended up transitioning from San Francisco to go running the company at his request and after the partners' vote. So I moved from San Francisco to Boston. He went back to Bain Capital. There I am running Bain Inc. We bought the company for $1 and took on a lot of debt. It's called management buyout. Looked great on paper. It's really hard. It's really hard. And so I'm running this thing as best as I can. It's a partnership, operations around the world. It was shrinking before it grew. But by kind of the early 90s, late mid-90s, things were going well. Had phenomenal organization, great partnership. Economy wind was at our back. And I started hearing a voice. Now, not one of those voices where you've had too many beers on a Friday night, not that voice. A different voice. A different voice. The voice that said, what's your life about? What's your life about at the end of the day? A voice that asked, if you only had 10 years to live, what would you do with it? A voice that said, how do you think about yourself versus your community? What's your legacy? This is a little voice. A voice that reminded me of how I grew up and reminded me, despite that I was in this fancy company and it was growing fast and was making plenty of money, more than you could ever want, way more than my dad made, in a lifetime. and that little voice. So I started confronting the question. Einstein said questions are more important than answers. And that is, as near as I can tell, absolutely true. If you are not asking the right question of yourself, if you're not asking the right question in a business situation, in academics, any situation, if you are not tracking on the right question, guess what? You're not going to find answers that are all that relevant. So I started asking that question. What about my life? Where's it going? Love Bain, love business, love helping grow organizations, love helping other people succeed. But the voice said, you know, maybe there's more. Maybe it's not just about business. Maybe it's about service. The upshot of that, I don't need to take you through the details. The upshot of that was beginning to explore a life of service. What would that look like? And I started talking to people. Career note, don't do things abruptly. Experiment, test, get some data. Do not do things abruptly. Even if things look great, don't get married on the first date. You don't do stuff like that. I was working at Bain once, the guy, he was a new partner, a great guy, call him Harvey. And Harvey had 4 kids, everything was terrific. Gets a call from a headhunter. Headhunter says, got a great opportunity for you. It's terrific. Let's call it in Oklahoma. Never been to Oklahoma. I got a great job, da 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 da. Long story short, he got seduced and ends up in Oklahoma with his 4, 5, 6 kids. He'd never been there before. Turns out he didn't like Oklahoma. Nothing wrong with Oklahoma. It's just he wasn't running toward that. It was random, a little too random. Anyway, questions more important than answers. I'm asking this question. I'm testing, wrote a business plan for something that became the Bridgespan Group. And decided at, I guess I was around 44, to step down from Bain & Company. I've been growing, say, 30, 35% a year, and leave this organization that had 2,200 people in 20 plus countries, and join a charity. Myself and 3 others. At the time, no pay. We'd raised money. We had a business plan, so it wasn't like we were just abruptly doing this. I thought hard about it, had a board. But it was a huge transition. And I had 2 of my partners who I trusted and liked. They were good friends come into my office one day after this had been announced, and they said, with the door shut, are you okay? And I didn't. They thought I'd received bad news from a doctor. And I'll tell you what, we're all, the best you're going to do in life is to live a life that is useful and fulfilling. Useful to others and fulfilling to yourself. And man, it's hard to do that. And I kind of got lucky in a lot of ways, guided by this notion of useful and fulfilling. And so now it's been 12 years. And Bridgespan has a couple hundred people in 3 offices. It does consulting services, executive search, the job board training. A big part of what we do is knowledge. Teaching. Because we are a nonprofit organization and we can't begin to meet the demand for all of our services. And what we want to do is influence as many folks as possible. So in that context, we produce content. In that context, I co-authored a book called Give Smart last year about philanthropy. And what I do now is shift into some of what we learned about philanthropy. Not because all of you are going to run foundations anytime soon or, make $1 gazillion next week, or if you do, give me a call because I've got some ideas for you. But here's why. It's because it turns out that while people have different amounts of money, they all have the same amount of time. You all got 24 hours a day for whatever number of days God's going to give you. And how you use that time matters a lot. It's the most scarce resource. So whether you're volunteering or writing checks, you're still using a scarce resource to achieve something. So let me flag some of the themes we learned around philanthropy that are in the book. And then I'm going to twist to say how some of that might apply to our lives. The most defining characteristic of philanthropy today is an increasing desire to have an impact. People can give money away for a lot of reasons. You give money to give back. I write a check to UC Davis to give back. I can give money because I feel guilty. I can give money because I'm asked. I can give money if it's a lot of money because I want to protect from taxes. There are lots of different reasons. Lots of reasons. It's deeply personal. But sometimes And more increasingly, people say, I want something to happen as a consequence of my time and my money. I want to see results. There's a beautiful Hebrew phrase that a Jewish friend of mine taught me. Some of you probably know. It's called tikkun olam. It means to repair the world. To repair the world. And one of the trends we see in philanthropy is an increasing number of people who are engaging at all levels with money and time combinations to try and repair the world. A few themes. The key differentiator between philanthropists that achieve a lot and those that maybe don't is that excellence is self-imposed. Now, what in the world does that mean? Business has it easy. If we all decided to start a restaurant and we could figure out what we wanted on the menu, and we opened our restaurant and customers came in, we would know which of those entrees sold and which didn't. So maybe the raw sardines don't sell so well, but the cheeseburgers are great. We'd get feedback from our customers, wouldn't we? We would know pretty quickly what's working and what isn't working. That's true of most things in life. There are feedback loops. In philanthropy, the feedback loops are muted and distorted. If you give money away, you don't actually know what happened as a consequence of that. Oftentimes it's really hard or very expensive or just impossible to figure out the causality of it. If you volunteer time, how do you know? Now, if you're mentoring a child, you know whether that child succeeded or not and got into high school or went to college. But lots of times you just plain do not know. The key characteristic then between folks who over time achieve more is that they say, I want to do this as well as I can do it. How can I do it better? They ask questions all the time. They are never complacent. I had a professor, Wick Skinner was his name, who insisted on calling me Mr. Tierney, which always scared me. And he was one of these quintessential old-time professors with a bow tie. He lives in Maine. He's now in his 80s. He's a close friend. He invites me over to his house one night, and I walk in, and he says, have a seat. And then he said, never get comfortable. And being kind of dumb, I thought he was talking about the sofa I was sitting on. He was not talking about the sofa I was sitting on. What he meant was, do not be complacent. Never get comfortable. Do not feel like everything is a-okay. Because why? You'll stop asking the tough questions, like how can I do better? Am I doing the right thing? What's working, what isn't working? So this notion of, I want to get better, I'm going to ask my tough questions, I'm going to raise the bar higher and higher, is central to successful philanthropy. That's why we organized Give Smart around 6 questions. There are 6 questions around philanthropy, but those questions have a little more power than that. Here they are. The first 3 are strategic. For a philanthropist, they're strategic. What are my values and beliefs? That's a simple one. The reason that's important in philanthropy is if you don't know what you care about, really care about, how do you spend the money? Is it climate change? Is it poverty? Is it my local neighborhood? Is it Africa? What are my anchor points? What's really important? What are my values and beliefs? What is success and how are we going to achieve it? Success, boy, that's an elusive thing. What's a successful life? Depends on you. Your definition. What is success if you're giving money or you're trying to change a policy? Or what does success look like? It's a tough question. Third question is a real toughie. What am I accountable for? Accountable? Me accountable? I'm just writing a check. I'm just volunteering. What am I accountable for? Those are strategic kinds of questions. The back half of the book are more execution questions. What is it? What does it take to get the job done? Most things in life take longer and cost more. Guarantee it. Little postulate, put it in the bank. No matter what you're doing. Your car breaks down, it will cost more to fix it than you expect it to. It just will, no matter what. And it will break down again. Everything tends to cost more and take longer. So what does it really take to do whatever it is you're trying to accomplish? How do I work with grantees? Is Quest Chapter 5. Or in this context, it might be, how do I work with others? And question 6, the most important question in the book for a philanthropist, and I think the most important question in the book for most of us, am I getting better? Am I really getting better? When you're in school, you kind of know how you're trending. You got a lot of feedback loops. You're getting grades, for better or for worse. You can track it over time. Maybe you're getting jobs. You're looking at this. There's a lot of short-term feedback loops. Out there in the real world, the feedback loops are a little bit more distorted. not just in philanthropy, but in everything else. You work in a company, you get an annual performance review. Maybe useful, maybe not useful, but once a year is not enough. So this am I getting better question is one that loops back to old Wick Skinner and the complacency thing. Don't get comfortable. Those are some themes, some questions around philanthropy. There are 4 patterns that aren't explicitly outlined in the book that I'm going to flag for you now. There are patterns around successful philanthropy, patterns that may, in fact, be relevant beyond that. Pattern number 1, I've already highlighted. It's this relentless obsession with getting better at whatever it is you're doing, keeping that bar up there, imposing excellence on yourself. Pattern number 2, fewer, bigger, longer. Well, what does that mean, Tierney? Fewer, bigger, longer. You guys know this. If you want to get good at something, you have to do it multiple times. If we all decided to take up a musical instrument, and all of you chose one instrument and I chose 5, and we got back together a year from now, every one of you would be better than me, because I'm trying to choose 5. Now, for those of us that are, don't like to make definitive decisions, we say, oh, maybe I'll choose 3 instruments and see which one I'm best at. Yeah, the patterns, inescapable pattern, you want to achieve stuff in life, do fewer things in a more significant way for a longer period of time. Another way of saying it, it's the magic of compounding. You put a nickel in the bank and it grows at 10% or 5% a year, not right now, but normal times. Then what happens over time, you make a lot more money. You compound in your skill set. You compound in your reputation. You compound in the people you know in your social networks. All of those are compounding things. And so where do you want that compounding to occur? Fewer, bigger, longer. Important for this conversation, time and influence tend to be more important than money in philanthropy. Who knew? You look at the patterns back there in all the success stories, it wasn't just about writing checks. It's never just about writing checks. If it was just about writing checks, we would have fewer problems. Our schools in America would be better. Our environment would be better. It has not been a problem of money. It's not that more money isn't useful. It's that money alone doesn't solve problems. People solve problems. It's back to that talent thing. Insight solve problems. Innovation solve problems. Not just money. And the final one, which merits a lot of consideration for those of us that like to think about things, is that execution matters more than strategy. Pervasive pattern in philanthropy. Pervasive pattern throughout the social sector. That's spoken from somebody who has, let's say, 3 decades of strategy-related stuff. Books and articles and advising and blah, 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 blah. Not to mention general management. Execution matters more than strategy. It's not that strategy doesn't matter, but think about any sports team. Is it the playbook or the players? The playbook has to be good enough, but doggone, it's the players that score the points. It's the players. And so in life, you ask, how do you get things done? And it's why the back end of the book with those 4 questions are so important. Now, I opened up my remarks today by saying that we are in an historic era. And I think we are when it comes to the social sector, an amazingly historic era. And since my co-author Joel Fleischman and I published the book last April or so, we've done dozens of events with groups of all kinds around the country, even in the UK. I've literally been interacting with, a few thousand people. And what's been fascinating, I stepped back over the holidays to kind of reflect on what were the surprises. And I'll tell you one of the big surprises. I'm going to wrap up now, and it's the back end of my chat here. One of the big surprises is people have come up and said, those questions in the book, those themes, those patterns, they actually apply to my life. They apply to my life. They don't just apply to giving money away, they apply to my life. And I remember the first person did that. I said, what are you talking about? This isn't a kind of career book. What color is your parachute or whatever. I mean, it's not that. It's a good book, by the way. It's not that. They said, no. What are my values and beliefs? I got to get anchored in that. What is success in my life? That's that nagging voice that I listen to. Remember that question, what's all life? What's it mean? What if you only had 10 years to live? What am I accountable for? Accountable for? Am I accountable? Am I accountable for volunteering? Am I accountable for making the world a better place than I found it? Am I accountable for voting? What am I accountable for? Whoa, those are tough questions. And boy, that last question, am I getting better? The big aha, or one of them over this last few months, has been people taking questions around philanthropy and translating them into questions around life. I don't want to overplay the book. And don't worry about buying the book. Go to givesmart.org. The questions are there. Most of the content, everything, all the content our publisher would let us put online is there. So don't worry about that. But do worry about the following. Or at least not worry, but consider. If we're right that we're in this historic era, and there's an old phrase that I really love, that all time is not equal. All time is not equal. And for any of us at any point in time, we like to think, gosh, our time is really an unequal time. This is the coolest time ever. There's a lot going on here. Yeah, but right now, this decade, as near as I can tell from my windows, this is a highly unequal time. It's an unequal time. We're talking about the social sector because of the dynamics that are going on there, the innovation that's going on there, the blurring of boundaries, the wealth transfer, the talent infusion, all the new organizations, all the new ideas. That's an unequal time. It's also an unequal time in that the needs of our communities in our country and the world are increasing, and the resources may not be increasing as fast. It's also an unequal time because we had 20, 25 years of dramatic economic expansion in this country. We may not have that in the next 25. It may be different. That doesn't mean it won't be worse, but it may be different. It will be worse. So it's an unequal time. Now, unequal times can be scary. Gosh, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? When businesses in industries that hit turmoil times, when businesses are in those unequal times, the biggest mistake a business makes, and I think the biggest mistake people can make, and even countries possibly, is to hunker down. You do not hunker down in unequal times. You do just the opposite. You stand up and you think and you ask the tough questions. You try to figure out what's going on. Now, all these conversations I've had with all these people over the last few months, it is extraordinary the amount of energy and goodwill that's out there in America. I have a 17-year-old son who's headed off to college next year and headed south, not this far south, but south. I live in Boston. And he says, I feel better when I don't listen to the news and don't read the paper and don't go online. And just try that. I mean, just turn it all off. Because, people are still people. We're all Americans. We're all trying to do the right thing. Most people are trying to lead meaningful lives. Most people are trying to lead useful lives and lead fulfilling lives. Most of us are doing that as best as we can do it every day. And as near as I can see, we are in this unequal time that is actually really exciting. And I am an optimist, so, warning label. But the optimist in me says there will be more opportunities during this unequal time for people like you who confront the questions that matter to you the most, who don't get too comfortable on the sofa, who are willing to create and innovate, who are willing to take a little bit of risk. It'll always seem scarier than it really is. And willing to say, what's right for me? How do I lead this useful, fulfilling life? Not just for a year, but for decades. So I'm going to wrap up, and then we're going to do some questions, but I'm just going to wrap up with a little request, just a little tiny request. Our country, our communities will depend upon people stepping forward, people engaging. And the one thing that's really important about unequal time is bystanders are not allowed. This is not the time to be a spectator. This is time to engage. Engage in whatever way you want to engage. Engage with, an hour a week or an hour a month. Engage on asking, what is your value added to the world? Maybe a little bit now, maybe more 20 years from now, maybe when you're, successful in whatever way you want to be successful. Maybe you're a bus driver at age 45 and say, I want to be a mentor. Who knows? Ask yourself the tough questions and step forward. Just step forward. Part of what I'm doing at Bridgespan is, in a little way, what my parents taught me to do, and I mentioned in the front of the book, and that is to do my share and then some. So I know you guys will do that. Do your share. Thanks.
Thank you. We have some time for questions.
Any kind of question.
Any kind of question.
That doesn't mean I'll answer it, but please.
Out of all the positions you've held throughout the many jobs that you've worked, which do you feel have had the biggest impact on yourself and or other people?
Oh, the question you heard, of all the jobs I've had. It's a great question. I think the way I answer that is it maybe isn't the position, but it's the value added of the position. So what I've taken the most joy in has been helping others succeed. And it's one of those things where, that doesn't mean it's not about, all of us have our own selfish, but that has brought great joy. I said, if I looked at, if somebody else answered that question, they would probably say that creating Bridgespan, starting a new organization that scaled successfully, has so far, been more important than anything else. A way to think about, I was talking to another guy last night about this, is if I didn't do that, I being any of us, if we weren't there, what difference would it make? So if you ever find yourself in a situation where, if you turn the clock back over the last 2 years, I literally didn't show up, what difference would it make? And you, as best as possible, you'd like to be in positions in life where actually if you don't show up, if you weren't the person in that job, something would change. And it may not be obvious. It may be, ever watch that movie, It's a Beautiful, Beautiful Life, Beautiful World. The movie they play around the holiday time. Wonderful Life. Should know that. I've seen it a million times. So you see the lead character who, passes away and can see how the world would have been without him. And it wasn't all that great. So we don't always know what impact we're having. But I think in general, the answer to your question is try to find positions where your value added is special. Where if you weren't doing that, whatever it happens to be, something would be different. And it has to be not just about what you're achieving, but also your fulfillment. No one has ever lived, no one in the history of the world, no one has ever existed like you. Or like you, or like you, or like you. No one. That is just a fact. It is just a fact. No one has ever lived like you. One of the ideas that makes me nuts, and this is not directly an answer to your question, but it might be useful in a little way, is this notion that I'm on track. On track. And companies do this all the time. You're on track. Okay, track. Who put the tracks here? Why am I on the tracks? I have this image of you on this track that somebody else put down. You do not know who put the track down. You do not know where it's going. It's not your track. It's somebody else's track. You might want to be on that track, but make the decision to be on that track. Do not let the track win by default. No one has ever lived like you. No one's ever lived at this time. No one's ever been here in this day, at this point in history. You figure out what your special calling is. And it may be to be a bus driver. Then be the best bus driver possible and influence the other bus drivers and influence the passengers and build a better bus company. Don't judge through other people's eyes. Judge through your own heart and soul. Judge through your own values. Business schools, for example, are wonderful things. I greatly value my management education. But sometimes management educations, and I guess all kinds of educations, can put a lot of emphasis on building a resume rather than building a life. And I don't know, I think about the 17-year-old I mentioned earlier, or 24-year-old who's an entrepreneur. A lot of their peer group, and maybe some of you, gosh, they were focused on college when they were about 6. Not my sons, but many kids are. And you kind of got to do that, and you worry about, how I look on paper. How do I look on paper? How do I look on paper? That's important in some ways. But building a resume is not building a life. It's not. And so part of the answer to your question, I don't mean to be too philosophical here, but focus on building your unique life, whatever that means, and do not be afraid to pursue your own track. And if it is somebody else's track, great, but make it a conscious decision. Slightly longer answer. Sorry.
Alan has a question here, and then raise your hand and we'll give you a microphone to you. I know Mike and the long woman.
Okay, should we go next?
Yeah, you go ahead.
At least traditionally, I think at Bain & Company, they would measure success by tracking a portfolio of their clients, looking at their stock appreciation relative to the appreciation of just sort of general market indices, and somehow this served as a proxy of the impact that Bain had in terms of making their clients more successful. I'm just curious that at Bridgespan and at Bridgestar, how do you measure success? Because as you noted earlier, this is much fuzzier than the economic measures that you have traditionally in the marketplace. And could you explain a little bit more about exactly what Bridgespan actually does and
Sure.
how you measure the impact of what it does?
Okay. The idea behind Bridgespan was to create a professional services firm. So think about a Bain & Company that does consulting, or a Bain Capital that does investment, or a bank that works with finance, or an executive search or educational institution that trains people. The idea behind Bridgespan was to create a professional services firm that serves nonprofit organizations and foundations. Now, important caveat, you can take the social sector and put it in two buckets, crudely speaking. One bucket are nonprofit organizations that have wealthy beneficiaries. This one. Universities have wealthy beneficiaries. Arts organizations. I go to the Boston Symphony. Wealthy people are sitting there listening to the music. They consume the product. Hospitals have wealthy beneficiaries. It's not to say these organizations don't matter. They just have a different set of constituents. Oftentimes they have earned income. They often have endowments. They often have bricks and mortar. There's another portion of the social sector that actually do not have wealthy beneficiaries. Human service organizations serving disadvantaged populations. Environmental organizations serving problems of the commons. They do not. So Bridgespan decided in our early days, we're going to be a professional services firm that serves those organizations that do not have wealthy beneficiaries, especially disadvantaged populations, civic engagement, social justice, the environment, things like that. Why? Because the organizations in that space are disadvantaged themselves. There's kind of market failure going on there. You know, these other organizations have access to people like Bain and McKinsey and things like that, but these other organizations that we're focused on don't. So they say, aha, what's success look like? Remember my question, what does success look like? Our mission was to help these organizations achieve breakthrough results. Holy cow, breakthrough results. I'll give you an example of our first client, because I think this is what we aspire to do. First client was a nonprofit in Harlem called Riedland Clinic. It then became Harlem Children's Zone. We started with Riedland Clinic 12 years ago. They're in 17 or 18 businesses. They're dealing with a certain segment of kids in Harlem. And the leader, Jeff Canada, a brilliant guy, not a manager. This thing had scaled. I don't remember the numbers exactly. It might have been 15 million in revenue. So pretty big, but pretty small relative to the problem. Fast forward now 12 years. Harlem Children's Zone, it's now called, is not only 60 or 70 million in annual revenue, it is the model for other similar programs in other cities. When the president started the social investment fund, whatever, 18 or 24 months ago, he, in the press release, highlighted 4 nonprofit organizations as models for what they wanted to help achieve. Scaling what works was the phrase. And Harlem Children's Zone was one of them. By the way, all 4 were Bridgespan clients. We can't serve very many clients. But this breakthrough results, you actually know when an organization is achieving breakthrough results because other people start to emulate it. Because they can say, you know, we are really getting results with these kids. Look what's happening. They're getting into high school. They're getting out of high school. They're actually getting into colleges. So Bridgespan's success is a function of the success of organizations and people we serve. And we measure that in a lot of different ways. Some ways, like Harlem Children's Zone, you actually know when it's happening. It usually takes time. We have other kinds of measures. We do surveys of our client, every single client engagement, anonymous survey. We're now starting to do data collection on what's happened to clients a year and even 3 years after we've worked there. We're a nonprofit organization. Nobody earns a bonus. There's no upside to taking more work. We're totally sold out at all the time. And so part of our dilemma, by the way, is to pick the right spots. We have a client selection committee. I guarantee you professional services firms that work for profit do not have client selection committees. They try to make the right decision with clients, but they're, if the client's paying and all this and that, fine. I mean, when's the last time the law firm said, we're not going to take your work because our client selection committee rejected you? Or the accounting firm or anybody else. It doesn't work that way. We have a client selection committee. You have to meet certain criteria. One of which is you have to be a role model for other people. If you succeed, other people need to be able to follow. Another is we need to create knowledge together that's useful for others. Harlem Children's Zone, we've published case studies, we've written articles, we've used them in many, many, many examples. So that's how we think about it, because we need a huge multiplier. Bridgespan's strategy for the next decade, which is way harder than what we've done in the last decade, is to increase our social impact 100 times while no more than doubling the size of the organization. So scaling impact, not just scaling the organization. It is relatively easy to scale the organization. We could go from 75 consulting projects a year to 150 projects a year. We know how to do that. There's plenty of demand. That would be fine. We can double that. But how do you increase impact 100x? We're not sure. We know it has to do with new ways of doing things. We moved into executive education. We're now educating dozens, soon hundreds of nonprofit leaders around the country. We know it has to do with using technology. We know it has to do with IP, hence the book, hence a lot of other articles and content, big investment in the web, our web presence. But how do you increase 100x? And by the way, the measurement question, it's relatively easy when you're in direct services to understand causality and what you've done and whether your client succeeds downstream or not, and maybe what they think of your value added and what other thinks of your value added. Once you move from the 2x to the further on out of that range to 100x, so somebody might read Give Smart, and they might change their behavior as a consequence of that, but how do we ever know? I don't know. How does this university know its value added to students? Can they say, here was the potential as a freshman, here's the potential as a graduating senior, and the delta is 2.3. How do we know? Maybe the university just is really smart in its admissions process and all of you would succeed anyway. Those of you who are students. Who knows? So there are different kinds of value added and different kinds of causality. The reason it's really important, by the way, to have some sense for the results you're getting is to allocate your scarce resources. Just like, Bridgespan has scarce resources, all of you have scarce resources, only so much time. So you have to ask, gosh, which of those, investments you're making of those scarce resources are paying off? Great question. Yeah. There was a question over here. I've got to answer slower or faster or something.
I work with a clinic in Haiti where we give free treatment and pharmaceuticals to the people of Cité Soleil. And we want to get better, but of course for that we need funding. But we're an organization that has very little overhead and no paid American execs, so we don't have a grant writer or anything like that. How would you recommend an organization like Haiti Clinic goes about applying for grants and trying to get funding? Okay, no magic answer on this stuff. But I'll tell you, it is generally true that relationships precede check writing, just generally. So engaging individuals in what you're doing will be a precursor to getting those individuals to write checks. And this, by the way, is true whether you're a small nonprofit organization in Haiti or whether you're Jeff Kennedy in Harlem Children's Zone. Why? Because philanthropy is personal, and people need to be personally engaged. Yeah, I mean, you're right. Once in a while, we write checks to things we don't know about, and we may go to Donors Choose and give it a little gift or something. But the reality is, people want to be connected emotionally. So getting people connected emotionally is the way to do that. Now, that means, okay, how do you know who you don't know? How do you meet those people? Lots of nonprofits address that by putting together an advisory board or a board of some kind of people who have their own networks, and then you build on that. You just build it. There are no shortcuts. There just are no shortcuts. And this issue of capital for nonprofits is a giant issue. It's one of the reasons that the nonprofit sector is more complicated in some ways than the business sector. In business, if you have a really successful company, if you're Mark Zuckerberg and you're at Facebook, you do have no problem attracting more money or any other success story, right? Because if you're growing, and the numbers are all there, you're going to attract capital. Growth capital is easy to find in the business sector. In the social sector, nonprofit sector, it's hard to find. It's really hard to find. And in fact, there's even a pathology that if you're doing really well and you've earned some, you've got some grants coming in, donors will say, well, you've already got enough money. Yeah, but I'm serving 500 children. I could serve 1,000. And look what I'm doing with 500. You say, yeah, but you're already doing well. I'm going to go do something else. It's kind of nutty. But capital does not flow rationally in the social sector. And so that means a lot of effort. We did a survey a few years ago of nonprofit leaders. These were smaller nonprofits, but not tiny, not really tiny. A few $1 million a year in gross receipts. The average executive director of those spent about 70% of his or her time fundraising. So gosh, I didn't get into the business to be a salesperson. I got into the business to help kids or the cause or whatever. That's just the deal. And so that means, boy, oh boy, a lot of investment is required. And then there are other things you can do to try to break out. There's a fellow at Bridgespan that co-founded the 1 Acre Fund, which is this neat nonprofit. He became a Skoll Award winner. And so that sort of all of a sudden catapulted them. So they're, applying for those things, trying to break out of the pack is another useful strategy. More questions?
Yeah.
How are we doing? Perfect.
Mike's the last question now.
Oh, Mike's last?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
There you are.
So I was curious, when working with Bridgespan and Bridgestar and developing talent in the companies you work with, what are some of the major challenges you face or differences that you wouldn't necessarily have at Bain or other companies you've worked with?
Okay. You talk about the business versus a social sector kind of talent. It's a really great question. So let me try to do that. We work a lot with folks that are moving from one sector to another. We call them bridgers. You hear a certain theme in this, right? Bridging business and the social sector, bridging sources of capital and uses of capital. We said, what are the qualities that do and don't transfer from, say, a business space to a nonprofit or social sector space? One of the bigger differences has to do with culture. Most nonprofits are powered by passion. People aren't there for the stock options. They care deeply about whatever cause, whatever problem they're solving, whatever beneficiaries, the children, whoever they're trying to help, that's what they care about. Businesses can be powered by passion, but boy, it's different. And so that cultural part is hard for folks. The actual business models are really different. In business, we just said growth capital is easier to come by than in the social sector. There was a fellow we were placing we have a little executive search business that we started because many of our clients weren't getting the right level of service from the search industry. They were too small, the jobs didn't pay well enough. So we said, well, we're gonna build this to serve our client base. This fellow was moving from the business world into the nonprofit world. And he met with the board and they reviewed all the financials. And he said, gosh, you only have 4 months of cash in this nonprofit. You only have 4 months of cash. Who's running a business? And the chairman of the board looked at him and said, yeah, we've never had so much cash. It's great. So, the cultures are different. The business models are different. The issue of how you get things done is dramatically different. Why? Well, in business, you can exercise what Jim Collins would call executive leadership, which is, you're the executive, you tell me to do something. Now, we might have consensus, but you are the boss. And I got that. Now, in the social sector, how does that work? You have volunteers. Huh? Can you fire a volunteer? I'm going to pay you less. No. You've got stakeholders, you've got donors that are sitting on your board. What corporations have Wall Street investors sitting on their board? Isn't that kind of weird to have two hats on? You've got employees, colleagues in the organization that are there for passion reasons. They may have a different view of what the organization needs to do than you. You can't say, hey, listen, you don't do that, you don't fall in line, you're going to get a smaller bonus. They get no bonus. So this issue of executive authority in the business world contrasts with more legislative authority, more consensus building. Business people under the nonprofit sector said, gosh, everything moves so slowly. There's a reason for that. Whenever something's happening, ask yourself, why is that happening? Or why is something not happening? There's always a root cause. The root cause, when you have a lot of stakeholders, you have to persuade. You can't force. And that takes time. You have to participate. You can't control. And that takes time. And by the way, the problems are different. It turns out, and I love business. I just love business. I wish I could live 2 lives or 3 lives. I love business. That said, it is easier to make a widget than to change a life. It just is. It is easier to create a new app than it is to fix a school system. It just is. Why? Those other problems, they're big, hairy problems. They got all these other constituents. You can't control things. There's a million dimensions to it. Those big problems exist for a reason. The little problems exist for a reason. So for a bunch of really understandable structural reasons, structural around talent, structural around capital, structural around strategy, the social sector, if you had a $5 million nonprofit and a $5 million business, it is harder to get results with a $5 million nonprofit than it is to get results with a $5 million business, everything equal. Because they're kind of these structural barriers, it's different. Now that said, there's a bunch of things from business that translate exactly, and then I'm going to wrap up. Basic management principles. We say most nonprofits are strongly led and undermanaged. They're strongly led and they're undermanaged. Why is that? They're strongly led because if you don't have a zealot leading who can sell, who can marshal volunteers, who can convince people the impossible is doable, if you don't have that, you won't attract funding. You won't attract talent. You're toast. So strongly led is a requirement. Management, that's not a requirement. How many people go into the social sector and say, I want to be a manager? No, I want to help the kids. I want to solve global warming. I want to do something, but it's not management. So they aren't trained in management. They can't raise money for management. Management's not valued as much as the other things they're doing. And so strongly led, undermanaged. What translates great are management skills from business to the social sector. Some of it's basic. Financial stuff, basic budgeting, resource allocation. A lot of the blocking and tackling that managers and people in business learn translates really well. But the culture is different, the structural situation is different, making decisions is different. So I want to thank all of you for taking time out today. And just one request, I've got to ask, you've got no free lunch here. Y'all have many decades ahead of you, God willing. Please do your share. Thanks.